Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 16th of August. Today we're looking at some really important developments from the Kursk offensive, and then we'll look at continued combat in New York, in Hrodivka, and in Krasnohorivka. So as we're zooming in a similar vein to the sort of defensive woes that I discussed with one of Ukraine's defense lines that is being built along the Vavcha River just west of Krasnohorivka, we're going to look at some issues that are posed to current Russian positions around the town of Glushkovo and generally the Glushkovo district, which, as you can see within this red rectangle, is currently being evacuated by Russian authorities. This was announced now 2 days ago, and 20,000 Russian citizens are now under mandatory evacuation orders. And so clearly the Russian forces understand that there is going to be some movement in this region. And so as we look at the front line for a second, we don't have any sort of concrete changes to the front line based on geolocations. It's a lot of the same, and this is due to the Russians sending in a large amount of reinforcements both into Korenovo itself, but then also towards Snagost. And so the fighting remained around Biakhovo, just east of Snagost, and at the approaches to the city of Korenovo itself. Based on satellite imagery, we know that there are fires within Olgovka and Kramanoy, so it appears that the fighting has not really advanced past those two villages. So for now, the Russians do still retain control over this ridge over here, marked with the red rectangle, and this provides immediate cover for the Russians coming in from the roads in Rilsk and then advancing in the southeastern direction towards Korenovo. So that's very important for the supply lines and for the city itself. But then on the flip side, the Ukrainians control the heights to the southeast of the city, located over here, and these are south of Olgovka and Kramanoy. And this is really what gave the Ukrainians the linchpin and the spearhead to then advance deeper into Russian territory, whether it be northwards in this direction or westwards, like we're going to see later on in the video. And so due to a lack of footage from the front line, we're actually going to focus some more on the fundamentals of the geography here. And so as you can see, there is the Seam River. When we look at the Kursk side of the border, it starts over here, and I'll mark with red the areas that it passes through for you guys. So the Seam River, it passes through a lot of forested areas, some villages in this general area of southern Kursk, and then also just west of Korenovo, it passes near a really, really dense forested area, and then further north. And so the area that's of importance to us today is this region located south of the river. The southern bank has some villages, so you could see them on the map, but they are rather small in size. The most notable of them being Tetkino, which is really in a compromised position when you look at the border, given the fact that it is surrounded by this river and by various forested areas on both sides of the border. So it is just a paradise for DRGs. And then it's just really just enveloped due to the location of the village in relation to the Ukrainian arteries. We don't have any reliable numbers surrounding the amount of Russian soldiers located in these villages south of the river. Before the Ukrainians launched their offensive, it was really low in concentration because in Kursk Oblast, the main sort of garrison of FSB protection battalions was stationed out of Sudzha, which is now under Ukrainian control, of course. Also, you did have some elements in Tetkino, but then in the areas in between, really little to none. There may have been some conscript battalions manning nearby that had some duties of patrolling the border every now and then, but it wasn't sort of a permanent settlement near the border, and same thing can go for the villages nearby. So even beforehand it was low, and now because there are so many other critical parts of the front line where there's active defense or counterattacks, it's probably the case that a large or very small percentage of the reinforcements have been sent into this particular area. But now that could change due to the dynamics of the battlefield shifting towards this region. Now the issue is, if we're zooming in, there are three main bridges that supply this southern bank, and one of them goes through Glushkovo, of course, the main village in this region, besides Tetkino, another one through Zavnoy, and then a bit to the west, there's one in Karij, and then I think there's also one in Tetkino, but that one is, again, more detached from the current fighting, because when you're looking at the bridges here, they're going to be used by these Russian soldiers to cross over and either go to man the border directly southwards or to go and actually cross and defend in an area like Biakhovo or Snagost and prevent any sort of deeper Ukrainian push towards this southern bank from the east. That is important. So the river itself has a width of, depending on the location, 50 to 100 meters. So it definitely is substantial to a certain extent. It's not extremely wide, but it is enough to, of course, warrant those bridges and making the loss of such a bridge a big blow. And so, for instance, in Glushkovo, you can see here, if we're zooming in, that the bridge was destroyed. So for a couple of days, there were attempts by Ukrainian artillery. Could have also been HIMARS launched, and there were like 5 craters recorded here, but that wasn't enough to destroy the bridge. Then we saw the footage today of a missile being launched, probably from the Ukrainian Air Force with a JDAM kit, that ended up destroying the bridge itself. So now it can't be used anymore. So, you know, a bit to the east, there is now satellite imagery confirming that the Russians are setting up a pontoon bridge. So they've already prepared for this scenario, and they're going to begin with that construction. Now, if we're looking at the location of Glushkovo in relation to the front line, I think it's somewhere like, if we're measuring it now, I just want to see, then Glushkovo is around like 18 kilometers away in the eastern direction, where you have most of the Ukrainian resources. And then from the border, it's something like 10, 11 kilometers away. And so this puts it within the range of a lot of shorter range Ukrainian artillery, especially mid-range artillery. That's definitely going to be an issue. And you could expect to see a lot of HIMARS strikes in this direction, especially given what we're going to talk about later with the high amount of concentration of air defenses and MLRS systems near the Sumy border, especially in forested areas. And so you're going to see the Ukrainians try to take out these pontoon bridges and really try to create bottlenecks and even eliminate those bottlenecks in a similar way that we saw around the Dnieper River with the situation in the Kherson counteroffensive. Although the situation is different here because you do have 2 other bridges just to the west, and also the width of the bridges here is so much more narrow. You also have Tedkino to the west, and you have a physical connection through Karenovo. So, for instance, if you couldn't access any of the 3 bridges and you wanted to cross into the southern bank, then you could theoretically do that by passing through the city of Karenovo at this current time, and then go through the forest or through the main road, and then reach those villages. And so you have to do a pretty significant loop, but it is still possible. But it is so close to the front line that it would be really, really dangerous to send in large convoys of reinforcements and equipment through that area. And so if a bridge is taken out, then likely it's going to be transported across using some sort of pontoon or ferry. And so if we're zooming in Glushkovo now, there's work on pontoon, as we said. There's also the initial reports of Ukrainian shelling towards the bridge from Zhvanoy, and so now this one is under threat. The Zhvanoy bridge, I want to see how far away it is from the front line for you guys. If we're measuring it out, it amounts to somewhere around 14 kilometers. So again, that is pretty close to the border with Ukraine over here. And then the last one is also around 14 kilometers away. And then they're farther away, of course, from the eastern direction with the main Ukrainian advances. And so if we're looking at elevation, first of all, we already established that there is Ukrainian sort of high ground position located over here just to the east of the front line. So I'm marking it with this red rectangle. And then this really overlooks a large portion of the southern bank. For the most part, the southern bank is located on a river valley, or its extension really is in a low-lying area. And you can see that low-lying area in this sort of narrow red rectangle spanning from Tedkino to the Snagost area. Then the silver lining for the Russians is that they have control over this higher elevated position located in this salient. So I don't know how many troops really are here in the Troitsk area, but there probably are some, given the fact that the front line has not advanced deeper into these regions, and there was a Ukrainian presence confirmed a bit eastwards in Vnezhapnoy. So if you're looking at why the Russians have this sort of higher elevated region in the salient, it's because it's an extension of a much larger salient that the Ukrainians have under their control at the moment within Sumy Oblast. And so this is one of the areas, this axis of advance for the Ukrainians, where they have some of the most advantageous positions on their end of the border. So you could see it sort of extend over here, just this massive ridge. And then it also extends further in the southeastern direction through a lot of the various forests located northeast of Sumy. And so that gives really high positioning for the mid-range artillery in this area. And then on a local level, allows the troops near the border on the Ukrainian side to overlook the southern bank of much of the Seam River. And so that would pose a threat for any troops that are actually operating along these villages here. Also, you can see that there aren't that many roads connecting some of these villages together. You do have the main road that crosses over the bridge into Glushkovo, so now you're not really using that road from the north to the south bank. But let's say you crossed over, then that one crosses through several areas that are near the river and then connects to Tetkino. But then in some of the areas that are further in the hinterlands, those ones don't have as solid of a connection, and the Ukrainians are right now actively working with the artillery to try to sever any sort of logistical connection here. So there has been a lot of preparation by the Ukrainians for the specific part of the front line, and it also would help them, the Ukrainians, in their goal of cutting off Karanovo from the south and getting control over the road over here, this vertical road. So they would look to do that in an effort to, of course, have access to the forested regions that are located just to the west of the town itself. And then that would be a great area for DRGs to operate and harass the perimeter of the Russian defenders here. And at the same time, we heard at the first days of the offensive information from Rybar surrounding concentrations of Ukrainian forces around the Tetkino. You know, in Hrodivka, this is an area where you had the older RDK raids across the border, but there isn't any sort of large unit presence that I've noted. I'm keeping very close track of the units here, and I don't have any information on specific elements that have been moved to Tetkino, so I can't really confirm any of that for now. But then north of Seam River, you have this massive ridge that is really, the extent of it is from the northern parts of the river all the way to Rilsk. And so all of the fields in between and the road connecting between those two locations is just on a massive, massive ridge. And this would be the advantage for the Russians, is that even though the area that they would be defending further south is located on low elevation, they would be protected from the rear, overlooking them from the north. And that would also overlook a large part of the battlefield that the Ukrainians would be trying to advance through, located a bit to the southeast over here with these two arrows. And so even if there is a disadvantage on the immediate level for the various Russian forces, then they do have this massive ridge to support them. Now, to actually zoom in on fighting, we see here that there is a geolocation that confirms in advance of the Ukrainian forces. This is a video of a Lancet hitting a Ukrainian armored vehicle in some of the bushes around Makhonovka. And so let's see how far this advance would take us from the previous confirmed Ukrainian location, somewhere in the ballpark of 1.5 kilometers. So now you can see that a lot of these eastern outskirts of Suja are being cleared out. So this Ukrainian momentum is pushing in the direction of Kolmakov and Agronom. As we said before, they've already secured control over Cherkaskaya, Konopelka to the south. And so that puts these sort of hamlets in a compromising position. But we do know that the Russian forces are trying to regroup with the 382nd Battalion of the 810th Marine Brigade in some of these villages and forests located 1 or 2 kilometers to the east of Mikhailovka. If we're looking a bit to the north, there's this really interesting video from the Flying Skulls units. I don't know why it's not labeled here, but it's just this long compilation of FPV strikes onto Russian equipment, Russian vehicles that are advancing along the R200 highway over here towards the battlefield in areas like Kruglik, which is currently disputed. Ukrainian sources assert they control it. Rybar says that it is contested, etc. And so this shows that this Russian sort of apparatus of logistic vehicles is even present in this area over here that is basically at the demarcation line. And so there is probably a deeper Russian presence in an area like Kruglik, at least to the extent that it is contested. And so those vehicles, 10 of them were spotted by the Flying Skulls unit, which is a unit that previously operated on the Pokrovsk front. And they were able to, of course, hit them. And these include loaves, SUVs, pickup trucks, and other sort of logistics vehicles. Not really any sort of armored fighting vehicles of the sorts. But this also confirms that the Russian forces do have a solid control over Bolshoi Soldatskoy, and they are using the span of the highway located southwest of that village to actually reach the front line. So here you guys can see the Flying Skulls group, and there's also new footage confirming the presence of the 130th Reconnaissance Battalion. I'm pretty sure their previous location was in Zaporozhye, but they really have been low-key over the past year. Now we're seeing them again, probably for some special operations forces. And then looking around, there were some new pieces of footage released from the Kraken Regiment of some vehicles that they exclusively utilize. We also know of the strong presence of artillery brigades, at least certain elements of them. And so here you have the TVAS unit of the 148th Artillery Brigade. There were also large artillery groupings in cities all around the Sumy region and in nearby oblasts. So in Poltava, for instance, you have this brigade, 48th, you have the 49th Artillery Brigade. And so certainly their assets are being moved closer and closer to the front line. And those batteries, in a lot of cases, are being actually sent to forests in that same ridge that I discussed that is actually really close to the front line. At the very least, it is very close to the location where the border was before, the Ukrainians launched their offensive here. And so in certain instances, it is within 10 kilometers or less of the previous border and is within 20, 30 kilometers of the actual front line. So I want to go through some footage that the Russians released today and just look at it with a critical lens and also reports on the actual losses that occurred. So I want to go through and see what occurred today. This is from yesterday of the HIMARS strike, which was the first strike, but then a couple of kilometers to the southeast near the village of Mokhritsia, you see that there was a video released by the Russians, and they claim to have destroyed 2 HIMARS during that strike. You can see that right before the HIMARS strike, there was a missile that flew out of one of the launchers over there. Again, there's some dispute, as there always will be when these videos are released, whether it actually was a HIMARS, but whatever launcher it was, it did release some missiles. And there did appear to be some sort of large secondary explosion. And so there were 2 Iskander strikes throughout the video. And then in aftermath footage, you could see the sort of destroyed carcass of one of those alleged HIMARS launchers, which would confirm that at least 2 HIMARS have been destroyed in this region really over the past 48 hours, if that were to be true. And again, in Mokhritsia, this is so close to the border. And even if it wasn't a HIMARS, it doesn't matter in the sense that they're still moving assets this close to the front line. You could see that it is about 20 kilometers away from where the Russians may be located at this point. And if we're measuring to the southeast, then it is around 17 kilometers. So a common theme is that these vehicles or TELs will be located in forested regions on higher elevated areas. In a lot of cases, rather close together, there are a lot of encampments near villages where it is just perfect to store these sort of launchers and vehicles. And so one area is near Sinya. And so there were 2 videos that were really close together. And if we're measuring it away from the location to the Russian border, then it's around 18 kilometers away. You can see here a video. It's of 2 Russian Tornado S MLRS, and they strike here at Buk M1, but this is from 10 days ago. The more recent video is from a Russian M Iskander strike on an Iris-T in that same forested area. Now, a lot of the Iris-T strikes have been decoys in the past, and so I don't know if this one is another sort of example. But then if they are using Iris-Ts, it would indicate that, again, they are moving in a lot of their Western weaponry, in this case, German weaponry, that have been used in the past to protect a lot of key parts of the front line or key parts of the rear, like Kiev. And so it shows the significance of the sort of defending that the Ukrainians need from Russian aerial attacks as they continue their advance deeper and deeper into Russian territory. And so the trade-off that the Ukrainians have been willing to take is moving in a large amount of artillery assets like HIMARS and generally MLRS systems to this region to assist in targeting the rear, targeting Russian rail depots, targeting logistics centers and nerves. And then also, of course, sending in the air defense to prevent Russian missiles from hitting these same Ukrainian columns or from hitting the rear. And also, they would hope to try to down the drones, the reconnaissance drones that the Russians are using. They're using, in a lot of cases, Orlan 10s or 30s, and those drones are doing a great job of evading the air defense of the Ukrainians, not even being spotted by them, let alone being shot down, and then actually fixing coordinates for the Russian Iskanders to actually launch strikes over here. In a lot of cases, even if it is a decoy, having accurate targeting. Russian sources also released a video today near Dnipro in the Aviatorske airfield, and it shows, again, a Russian Iskander M strike on a MiG-29. In the subtitle, it says that it's a Su-24, but a lot of people have been claiming that it's actually a MiG-29, and I believe that myself from what I see. And so this would be the 6th claimed MiG-29 that the Russians have apparently been able to destroy since April, and would also be the 4th attack on this particular airfield during this time of year. There are also some similar strikes on the Ukrainian Air Force over the past 2 months in the Mykolaiv and Poltava areas, more generally towards a lot of their assets, whether they be Su-24s or MiG-29s. And so in this case, I don't think it was a decoy. What Russian sources allege is that they were trying to fit onto the pylons of the jet Storm Shadow missiles. And during that specific moment in time, they're, of course, that's the moment where they're the most exposed because they're out in the open because you need to put in the actual missiles to the pylons. And that's when the Iskander actually struck. And you could see all along that you have the Orlan hovering above and recording all this. And based on satellite imagery, this MiG was only moved into this area after August 11th. And so this was a really recent movement. It's not something that has been staying idle here for a long period of time, which means that the reconnaissance drone is keeping very close tabs on the movement of Ukrainian assets over here and can then almost immediately begin informing the Russians on the rear to actually conduct airstrikes over here. And they're able to time it in a way that is really at the perfect moment for destroying these assets out in the open. And it's not just here. There was also a similar strike on what the Russians are claiming is the Patriots air defense system. Also, I think generally near the Dnipro River, although I'm not sure if it was further north or south. And then the video, the Iskander uses a cluster warhead. And so it doesn't appear like the Patriot air defense system was destroyed in that case, but probably there was some damage caused to the radars and some of the assisting equipment. And you could see that the Patriots trying to engage with the missile and it actually misses. And so that was a failure. Even if it wasn't destroyed, it wasn't able to intercept the threats. And then the other issue is that the Orlan is circling above it and is able to do so undetected and then fix the strike onto the same air defense. So really, it is not too surprising to see that there are these this massive influx of videos showing targets near Sumy because the Ukrainians themselves knew the risk when they were moving in the HIMARS and the various other systems in this region because they were believing that the cost was less important than the actual benefits that they could be yielded by bringing them closer to prevent Russian missiles and from preventing Russian Air Force from getting too close to the front line. And then also to have the artillery there to target the various Russian positions on the rear. And so then the drawdown is that you're going to get targeted more likely given how close you are. And then it also takes away assets from other parts of the front line, which leaves them more exposed and also leaves whatever is left remaining there more exposed to attacks by Russians. Okay, now to zoom in and begin looking at other parts of the front line. We're beginning with New York. There is just a slight update over here. We're seeing an advance in the southwestern direction from Zalizhnya. You could see here it's this 30-hectare land, and let's measure the extent once again. You could see it's nearly a 1 kilometer advance along this particular road. This road leads out of Zalizhnya. It passes through the electric substation and then makes its way into northern New York. And so now that the Russians are actually on this road and are past Toretsk itself, they are really, really close to cutting off this really massive salient that has been created and I've been warning about, which is not only being pressured from the southwest where you have this sort of recent advance by the Russians into the center of New York, it's also being threatened now from the north. And so it's very close to being sealed, the lid over here. And so then it forces the Ukrainians to get squeezed out. They have to get out before they are encircled. And this includes all of the troops that are located in these various houses in eastern New York, the ones on the trench fortifications over here, the ones in these forested areas. So the Ukrainians can, of course, try to conduct localized counterattacks in the same way they did with this school over here. And that would specifically cater to their sort of suffering in the central part of New York. Or they can then eventually give in to the Russian intentions and withdraw before there is any sort of risk of a mass encirclement over there. And you could see here that based on the advance, the Russians are located near the electric substation and that the Voron unit, 100th Mechanized Brigade, destroyed a Russian MTLB and BMP in this region. So, of course, the drone crews are still working and causing damage to the Russian side. Now, zooming in on Hrodivka, we just have another geolocation to further back up claims that I've previously made about the Russians being really in the eastern parts of the town already. So we do have videos from the 151st Mechanized Brigade, now even more detailed. So in this video, they used Baby Yaga drones to drop explosives and mines onto these Russian forces in residential areas near apartment buildings. So this just further backs up the claims we made previously about the Russian forces here being able to advance a maximum of 800 meters. And now to finish off, we're going to look at Krasnohorivka, because I haven't mentioned this part of the front line in a while, but there have been some gradual Russian advances which have allowed them to enter into the northern portion of the town, which is near the Lozova riverbank. It's sort of basically, it's just a new town in and of itself. It is so detached from the main concentration of buildings and facilities within the center of Krasnohorivka, but it's an area where the Ukrainians do still feel comfortable operating from. So there's this one portion over here that is further to the west, and then one further to the north that the Russians are also looking to take over. They already have this sort of foothold in the eastern side of the second one, and then they also have an attempt being made based on where you see the yellow markings to actually reach the floodplains of the Lozova River and cross over and begin attacks from the south towards the Ukrainian defenses within the residential areas in this sort of northern suburb, I guess you could call it. And we actually have this news article which interviewed members of the 21st Separate Special Purpose Battalion. And if we look at it, they told the Wall Street Journal some really important pieces of information surrounding this specific part of the front line. I don't think it's fair to take the numbers that they give and then extrapolate it for the rest of the front line, because Krasnohorivka itself is very unique in terms of the sort of battle that is being waged here. And so they say that as of now, there's this 10-to-1 artillery advantage for the Russian forces here, which is very realistic based on the fact that there is a massive garrison of Russian artillery stationed further to the east along the ridges near the city of Donetsk and some of its suburbs. So that makes a lot of sense. And I don't really see Ukrainian artillery units operating much around here. They also say there was a 5-to-1 manpower advantage for the Russians. Again, based on the sort of units that are operating around here, it's not too surprising. You don't see many full units here. It's usually just certain battalions or companies of larger units that are defending in some of these houses. And also there's not much of a surface area for the Ukrainians to even remain in, because they have to all hide in basements throughout much of the fighting. And there aren't that many basements left for the Ukrainians to actually inhabit at the current moment just north of Krasnohorivka. So at first, there was actually a 1-to-1 manpower dynamic, but over time, the Russians have been able to strengthen their pool of men, and a lot of times due to attrition rates, but also due to units being moved elsewhere, the garrison here has decreased. So in a lot of times, when you have a specific task that needs to be carried out that would require 5 or 6 men, now, in reality, the Ukrainians here can only muster up 2 to 3 men to conduct that same task. And so then when you extrapolate that to a larger level of battalion size, it does mean that on paper, it could seem large, but then in reality, it isn't able to fill all the checks. And then as a result of having a lack of actual core manpower to fight in the trenches, cooks, mechanics, whatever sort of rear role they may have, which usually could be the majority of a certain brigade, they were moved to certain parts of the front line, especially in Krasnohorivka, and had to remain in trenches for an extended period of time. And more generally, that is a complaint that is not mentioned by this unit of the Separate Presidential Brigade. So this is a rather important unit, rather strong unit with a lot of experience moving back and forth. And so they said that for over 100 days, they were located in the same trenches, these men over here, and were not able to find any sort of elements to rotate them in and out. And so there is of course, the complaint of exhaustion, being static in the same position for a long period of time, and then all the issues surrounding proper provisions of resources. So all in all, you could see that the defensive aspect of Krasnohorivka really is treading lightly. Previously, the garrison here was really well defended, had all the elevation and the defenses on their side, and now it's just completely flipped. They're relegated to defending in the outskirts of the town. They're relegated to moving across large swaths of open fields. And they do still have some bunkers in the region, which is how the Wall Street Journal was able to even reach the front line in the first place. But again, following the fall of Krasnohorivka, you're going to have just this massive open swath of land that cannot be easily defended by any large amount of soldiers. And so eventually they're going to be pushed out of this region as well, which will leave the defense to sort of solidify around the Vovcha River. I always talk about this, and it's very important that the Ukrainians actually secure this line of defense to prevent any sort of flanking attempts that we could see occurring further northwards in the Pokrovsk direction. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.